April 29, 1945. Dawn breaks over the Bavarian countryside, but there is no peace here. Inside the barbed wire fences of Stalag 7A, over 100,000 men wait in the darkness. Skeletal figures, hollow eyes, souls clinging to hope by a thread. They can hear it now. The distant rumble of artillery, the thunder of war drawing closer with every passing hour. German guards abandon their posts, rifles clattering to the ground as they flee. Something is coming. Something unstoppable. Across the Amper River, American Sherman tanks roll forward through the morning mist. The 14th Armored Division, battle-hardened, relentless. With one objective burning in their minds: reach Moosburg before it's too late. But between them and those desperate prisoners stands the 38th SS Grenadier Division, young soldiers, fanatics, ordered to hold this ground at any cost. The bridge ahead is wired with explosives. One detonation and the entire mission collapses. In hours, this quiet Bavarian town will erupt into chaos. Tanks will burn, men will fall, and the fate of 100,000 souls hangs in the balance. This is the story of Moosburg, where General Patton's fury ignited, where the 100th Bomb Group found their brothers in chains, where liberation came at the edge of destruction. The town of Moosburg sits nestled in the heart of Bavaria, its medieval architecture bearing witness to centuries of history. Founded in the 12th century, it proudly holds the distinction of being the oldest town between Regensburg and Italy, its ancient roots stretching even beyond the borders of Austria. But in the spring of 1945, Moosburg's historical charm means nothing. The town has become a strategic crossroads in the final desperate days of the Third Reich. The Isar River flows through its eastern edge, a natural barrier that could slow the American advance into southern Bavaria. And just northeast of the town center lies something far more valuable than any medieval landmark: Stalag 7A. The prisoner of war camp sprawls across the landscape like a scar on the earth. Originally designed to house 10,000 men, it now contains over 115,000 Allied prisoners crammed into every available space. The conditions are unspeakable: malnutrition, disease, lice, despair. Among these prisoners are American airmen from the 100th Bomb Group, men who once soared over German skies in their mighty B-17 flying fortresses. Bomber crews from Thorpe Abbotts in England, navigators, pilots, gunners, all brought down by flak and fighters, now reduced to shadows of their former selves. Throughout the war, more than 150,000 prisoners have been registered at this camp. Russians treated with brutal contempt. Western Allied soldiers housed in marginally better conditions, but still suffering. The German ability to care for prisoners has deteriorated beyond recognition as their own nation crumbles around them. Yet even in this darkness, hope flickers. Secret radios, assembled from scrounged components, bring news of the Allied advance. The prisoners know the Americans are coming. They know liberation is close. The question is whether it will arrive in time. April 29, 1945. Evening settles over the village of Mauren, 6 to 8 kilometers north of Moosburg. The pastoral scene of rural Bavaria is shattered by the arrival of American armor. The 14th Armored Division's lead elements rumble into position. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, the cream of American military might. At the spearhead rides the 47th Tank Regiment, their mission clear and urgent: secure the crossing over the Isar River and push south toward the Austrian border. Around the village church in Mauren's center, command posts spring to life. Officers huddle over maps by lamplight. Radio operators relay coordinates. Tank crews perform final maintenance checks, knowing that dawn will bring battle. The village has changed much since those war years, but the church remains, a silent witness to the preparations for violence. Around this sacred ground, American soldiers dig in for the night, establishing a defensive perimeter facing south toward Moosburg. They know what awaits them. Intelligence reports confirmed German forces in the town, SS troops, desperate men willing to fight for every meter of ground. But the Americans don't know about the bridge. Not yet. Across from them, preparing their own defenses, the 38th SS Grenadier Division takes position. This is no elite fighting force. Far from it. The division was hastily formed mere weeks ago in early April, a composite unit scraped together from the remnants of shattered SS divisions. The corps consists of survivors from other units, men who've tasted defeat on every front. Bulking out their numbers are fresh recruits from the SS officer school at Bad Tolitz, young men barely out of training. Among them, a future film star named Hardy Kruger, although none of them know what fate holds beyond tomorrow. The 3rd Battalion of the 96th Regiment receives its orders. Hold the line at the Amper River. Stop the American advance. Buy time for the remnants of the Wehrmacht to escape south. It's a suicide mission, and they know it. These soldiers lack heavy weapons. No artillery support. No armor. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German military might, has been swept from the skies by relentless Allied air power. All these young men possess are rifles, submachine guns, a handful of the new STG-44 assault rifles, and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. Against an entire American armored division, they might as well be armed with pitchforks. Yet they dig their foxholes along the Amper's banks, they sight their weapons toward the northern road, they prepare to sell their lives for a regime that is already dead, they just don't know it yet. April 29, 1945, 0900 hours. The American column moves south from Mauron in the gray morning light. Sherman tanks lead the advance, their 75mm guns traversing left and right, searching for threats. M8 armored cars fan out on the flanks, protecting the infantry marching between the vehicles. The 68th Infantry Regiment moves with practiced efficiency. These men have fought across Europe. They know their business. The column approaches the Amper River, and suddenly the morning erupts. German fire tears across the open ground. Rifle fire, machine gun bursts. The crack of small arms fills the air as the SS troops open up from their prepared positions along the embankments. American soldiers hit the dirt, scrambling for cover. Tank commanders button up their hatches as bullets ping off armor plate. The bridge looms ahead, intact and vulnerable. Here, the Americans face a crucial decision. Standard doctrine calls for a preparatory artillery barrage to soften enemy positions before an assault. But Stalag 7A lies just beyond the town. One miscalculation, one round falling long, and American shells could rain down on American prisoners. The order comes down from Division Command: no artillery. This will be close-in fighting only. Sherman tanks push forward, their engines roaring. The Germans unleash everything they have. Panzerfaust rockets streak across the river, trailing smoke. One Sherman takes a hit, the warhead detonating against its frontal armor. The tank shudders but keeps rolling, its thick steel holding. Return fire from the Shermans is devastating. High explosive shells slam into German positions along the embankments and the railway line beyond. The concussive blasts tear apart foxholes, sending earth and bodies skyward. American infantry advances under covering fire. M8 armored cars race toward the village of Feldkirchen, their turret guns blazing. From this flanking position, they pour fire into the German line, enfilading the SS troops with deadly accuracy. The open farmland that once characterized this area in 1945 provides no concealment. The young SS soldiers, pinned down and outgunned, face annihilation. Some fight to the end, firing until their ammunition runs out or until an American shell finds them. Others, realizing the hopelessness of their position, raise their hands in surrender. They emerged from their foxholes, hollow-eyed and trembling, to be processed by grim-faced American infantrymen.
By 10:30 hours, the Battle of Ampere Bridge is over. The 3rd Battalion, 96th Regiment has ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those who survived surrender number perhaps a few dozen. The rest lie scattered across the fields and embankments, adding their names to the final butcher's bill of a dying regime. American casualties are relatively light, though every loss stings. The infantrymen and tankers who fell here died within sight of victory, within days of the war's end. But there's no time for reflection. The mission continues. Moosburg lies ahead, and beyond it, the critical Isar River crossing. The column reorganizes quickly and pushes south into the town itself. 1110 hours. The lead Sherman of the 47th Tank Regiment rumbles through Moosburg streets toward the Isar River crossing. The massive stone bridge spans the wide, fast-flowing river, an engineering marvel that has stood for generations. The tank commander sees it ahead, the objective, the gateway to southern Bavaria. He orders his driver forward, accelerating toward the on-ramp. On the far bank, German engineers watch through binoculars. Their fingers rest on the detonator. They'd been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. The bridge is wired with demolition charges, carefully placed to drop the entire structure into the river. The Sherman reaches the base of the on-ramp. The German engineers twist the detonator. Explosions rip through the bridge's foundations. Massive stone blocks heave upward, then tumble into the churning waters below. The ancient structure, which has carried traffic across the Isar for so long, collapses in seconds. Dust and spray fountain upward, obscuring everything. When the debris settles, the American tank commander stares at the wreckage in disbelief. The bridge is gone. Not completely destroyed, but utterly impassable for vehicles. Infantrymen might be able to pick their way across the twisted remains, but 40-ton Shermans? Impossible. The irony of the situation isn't lost on the Americans who learn the details later. The Germans deliberately left the bridge standing as long as possible because it carried electrical cables supplying power to Moosburg. They prioritized civilian electricity over military necessity, only destroying it at the last possible moment. A decision that speaks volumes about the chaos and conflicting priorities of the Third Reich's final days. With the Isar crossing denied, the 14th Armored Division's pursuit south comes to a screeching halt. But there are other priorities now. Just northeast of their position, 115,000 men wait behind barbed wire. The decision is made immediately. Secure the camp, liberate the prisoners. Combat engineers are summoned forward. Their mission? Breach the flood defense berm and construct a pontoon bridge across the Isar. It will take time, but American engineering prowess will overcome this obstacle. In the meantime, the division pivots northeast toward Stalag ST-7A. For the prisoners at Stalag 7A, April 29th begins like every other day in hell, except it doesn't. The dawn brings something different, something electric in the air. The German guards are agitated, nervous. Some abandon their posts entirely, melting away into the countryside. Others cluster in small groups, arguing in hushed, frantic voices. The prisoners, skeletal figures in ragged uniforms, watch with growing excitement. Their secret radios have told them the Americans are close. The sounds of battle from the Ampere River confirmed it. The roar of artillery, the crackle of small arms, the rumble of tank engines. Liberation is coming. But when? The morning stretches into midday. The guards grow fewer. Some simply drop their rifles and walk away, abandoning their duty in the face of inevitable defeat. The prisoners begin to gather near the fences, murmuring, hoping, praying. They've endured so much, Years of captivity, starvation rations that leave them little more than walking corpses, disease sweeping through the overcrowded barracks, the constant humiliation and degradation. Among them are American bomber crews, men who once flew in the mighty B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, pride of the 8th Air Force. Navigators like Frank Murphy, shot down over Germany, who survived his aircraft's destruction only to endure years of slow death in this camp. There are also Russian prisoners, treated far more brutally than their Western counterparts. Men from every Allied nation, a microcosm of the coalition that has brought Nazi Germany to its knees. They all wait now, watching the main gate, listening for the sound of American engines. The guards at the gate receive orders to open it, to surrender the camp without resistance. The commandant, Oberst Berger, recognizes reality. Fighting is pointless. The war is lost. Just after noon, the first American vehicles appear on the road leading to the camp. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, the white star of the United States Army painted on every vehicle. The gates swing open. For a moment, silence. Prisoners and liberators simply stare at each other, the weight of the moment too enormous for words. Then the spell breaks. Prisoners surge forward, shouting, crying, laughing. Hands reach out to touch the tanks, to touch the soldiers, to confirm this isn't another cruel dream. American soldiers dismount, many stunned by what they see. These walking skeletons were once healthy young men, bomber pilots, infantrymen, tank crews, now reduced to living ghosts. Medics rush forward with medical supplies. Food is distributed, though carefully. Men who have been starving for months can't simply gorge themselves or risk death. Small portions, gradual refeeding, medical treatment for the worst cases. But beneath the joy of liberation runs a current of rage. The American soldiers who walk through Stalag 7A see conditions that defy belief. The overcrowding, the filth, the evidence of disease and neglect. This isn't a concentration camp. The Germans didn't gas these men or work them to death in slave labor. But the conditions are still appalling, falling far below the standards of the Geneva Conventions that supposedly protected prisoners of war. German prisoners held in Allied camps were treated incomparably better. That comparison burns in the minds of every American soldier who witnesses this scene. Word spreads quickly up the chain of command. Photographs are taken, reports are filed, and one particular general, known for his explosive temper and aggressive leadership, hears about Stalag 7A and decides he needs to see it for himself. May 1st, 1945, 2 days after liberation, General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, arrives in Moosburg. His purpose is twofold: inspect the pontoon bridge over the Isar and visit the liberated POW camp. Patton is a complex figure, a brilliant tactician, a master of armored warfare, a man who drives his troops relentlessly, who believes in speed and aggression above all else. He wears ivory-handled revolvers and speaks with profanity-laced eloquence. Some call him a genius, others call him a madman. Perhaps he's both. His jeep arrives at the Isar River crossing, where combat engineers have worked around the clock to establish a pontoon bridge. The temporary structure sways slightly as vehicles cross, but it's holding. The division can continue its advance south. Patton steps out of his jeep, surveying the scene with his characteristic intensity. The gas house building behind him will appear in newsreel footage from this day, a mundane backdrop to an explosive moment. A Sherman tank approaches the pontoon bridge, ready to cross. But something catches Patton's eye. The tank is covered in sandbags piled against its frontal armor. This impromptu armor modification, meant to provide extra protection against Panzerfaust rockets, has just drawn the ire of the most feared general in the American Army.
What follows is captured on film, though the audio is lost to history. Patton gestures angrily at the sandbags. His face is red. His body language screams fury. The tank crew stands at attention, receiving what those present describe as one of Patton's legendary tongue lashings. The general's logic is pure Patton. Those sandbags add weight. Weight means more fuel consumption. Fuel is precious. More than that, they represent a defensive mindset, caution, timidity, everything Patton despises. To the tankers who just want to survive the last days of the war, this might seem unreasonable. The Germans still have Panzerfausts. Men are still dying. But to Patton, who thinks in terms of operational tempo and logistics and the aggressive spirit that wins wars, those sandbags are an affront. After delivering his rebuke, Patton storms away from the tank toward the camera crew, his face still flushed with anger. The footage shows a general who, even with victory assured, demands nothing less than total commitment from his troops. But Patton's anger at sandbags is nothing compared to what he feels when he visits Stalag A7. Walking through the camp, surrounded by his staff, Patton sees the conditions firsthand. The overcrowded barracks, the inadequate sanitation, the emaciated prisoners who should have been protected by international law. One group of prisoners in particular catches his attention: American airmen. Men who look more like concentration camp survivors than POWs. Their ribs show through their skin. Their eyes are sunken. They can barely stand. Among them is Frank Murphy, the navigator from the 100th Bomb Group's 108th Bomb Squadron. Shot down over Germany, survivor of multiple camps. Now barely clinging to life. Patton stops in front of these men. For a moment, the general who moments ago was furious about sandbags is speechless. His staff officers watch as something shifts in his expression. Then Patton speaks, his voice carrying across the compound. "I'll kill the sons of bitches for this." It's not bombast. It's not performance. In this moment, witnesses report, Patton means every word with absolute sincerity. The fury in his voice is genuine, born from seeing American soldiers reduced to shadows. The general continues his inspection, his anger building with every step. By the time he leaves Stalag A7, those who know him say they've never seen him more enraged. In the final accounting of the war, Patton's threat remains unfulfilled. The Nazi leadership will face justice at Nuremberg. Camp commandants will answer for their crimes. But the moment reveals something essential about the nature of this conflict and the emotions it provoked even in hardened warriors. Stalag A7's full horror can't be captured in a single visit or a single general's outrage. The statistics alone tell the story of systematic neglect and suffering. Originally designed for 10,000 prisoners, the camp eventually held more than 11 times that number. The civilian population of Moosburg itself numbered around 7,000 during the war. Imagine a prison camp housing more than 15 times the population of the town it sits next to. The Germans called it Stammlager, a main camp for enlisted prisoners and non-commissioned officers. Unlike Stalag Left 3, made famous by the Great Escape, which housed primarily Allied airmen under Luftwaffe control, Stalag A7 was a Wehrmacht-run facility that held everyone. American bomber crews, British infantrymen, French soldiers, Russians treated with brutal contempt as Untermenschen, subhumans in Nazi racial ideology. The Geneva Conventions meant nothing for Soviet prisoners. Throughout its existence from October 1939 to April 1945, more than 150,000 prisoners passed through Stalag A7's gates. Some were transferred to other camps. Some died of disease, malnutrition, or the brutal conditions. Some, like Gail Cleven of the 100th Bomb Group, escaped during the death marches as the Germans evacuated camps in the face of advancing Red Army. Gail Cleven's story deserves special mention. Shot down in 1933, he endured years of captivity. But during a forced march from the east, as the Germans tried to move prisoners away from the advancing Red Army, Cleven saw his chance. One night, he slipped away from the column. For 12 desperate days, he evaded capture, making his way west toward American lines. Against all odds, he succeeded. Within less than 2 weeks of his escape, Kleven was back at Thorpe Abbotts, the airbase he'd flown from years earlier. He never saw Moosburg. But many others weren't so fortunate. They endured the marches. They ended up at Stalag A7. And by April 1945, the conditions had deteriorated beyond recognition. The German ability to feed prisoners collapsed as their entire economy imploded. Rations became starvation portions. Red Cross packages, which had supplemented diets earlier in the war, became less frequent as supply lines broke down. Disease ran rampant through the overcrowded barracks. Lice, dysentery, tuberculosis. Men wasted away, their bodies consuming themselves for energy. The medical facilities, never adequate, became completely overwhelmed. This wasn't systematic extermination like the Holocaust. The Germans weren't gassing these men or working them to death in slave labor camps, but the neglect itself was a form of violence, a slow death sentence carried out through indifference and callousness. Russian prisoners had it worst of all. Nazi racial ideology placed them beneath contempt. While Western Allied prisoners received some protection from the Geneva Conventions and the threat of retaliation against German POWs in Allied hands, the Soviets had no such safeguards. The Germans and Soviets both treated prisoners with similar brutality. When liberation came, the Soviet prisoners were often in the worst condition, emaciated beyond belief, many barely conscious. The American medics who treated them were horrified. Today, almost nothing remains of Stalag A7. The site has been developed into a residential area. Modern homes stand where barracks once helped thousands of suffering men. Streets run through what was once the camp's main thoroughfare. But a few buildings survive. Guard structures, administrative buildings. Their purpose is no longer apparent to casual observers, but they remain silent witnesses to history. A memorial stands at what was once the main entrance. Information boards tell the story in German and English. Photographs show the camp as it was, the barbed wire fences, the watchtowers, the endless rows of identical wooden barracks. The memorial is tasteful, respectful. It acknowledges what happened here without sensationalism, but it can't truly convey the experience of being imprisoned in this place for years. Imagine arriving here after your bomber was shot down, the German fighters that swarmed your B-17, the desperate bailout over enemy territory, the capture, the interrogation, then the long train journey to Moosburg, packed into cattle cars with dozens of prisoners. The gates opening to reveal a sprawling camp already far beyond its capacity, being processed, registered, assigned to a barracks so overcrowded that men sleep shoulder to shoulder on wooden bunks with no mattresses. The daily routine of captivity, roll calls in the freezing cold, watery soup that barely qualifies as food, the boredom punctuated by terror whenever Allied bombers flew over, knowing your own side might accidentally hit the camp. The secret radios provided a lifeline to hope, scrounged to components hidden from guards, listening to BBC broadcasts or American Armed Forces radio, tracking the war's progress, knowing liberation was coming but not knowing if you'd survive long enough to see it. As 1945 arrived and the Reich crumbled, conditions deteriorated further. The guards became more nervous. Food became scarcer. Disease spread faster. Hope and despair warred in every prisoner's heart.
Then, April 29th arrived. The sounds of battle, the fleeing guards, the opening gates, the Sherman tanks. For the men who lived through it, that moment defined their lives. Many struggled for years afterward with what we now call PTSD. The trauma of captivity, malnutrition, and constant fear doesn't simply vanish when the gates open. Just outside Moosburg, in the small hamlet of Oberwörth, lies the final piece of this story. A cemetery, carefully maintained, marks the original burial ground for prisoners who died at Stalag 7A. Memorials stand among the graves, simple stones bearing names, dates, nationalities, Some graves mark individuals, others remember groups of prisoners whose names were never recorded or were lost in the chaos of war's end. This is where the story of Moosburg truly concludes, not with the liberation, not with Patton's fury or the prisoner's joy, but here, with those who didn't survive to see freedom. They came from every allied nation. Some died early in the war when conditions were marginally better. Others perished in the final months, succumbing to disease or starvation just days or weeks before liberation arrived. Their sacrifice differs from those who died in battle. No glorious last stand, no heroic action earning medals and commendations. Just the slow, grinding death of captivity, forgotten by the world, waiting for a liberation that came too late. Yet they are no less worthy of remembrance. These men served. They fought. They were shot down or captured, and they endured until they could endure no more. Walking through this cemetery, reading the names, noting the dates of death scattered across 5.5 years of war brings home the true cost of this conflict. The newsreels show the great battles, the famous generals, the strategic victories. But here, in a quiet corner of Bavaria, lies proof that war kills in many ways, that suffering takes many forms, that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's simply the decision to survive another day in hell. The prisoners who died at Stalag 7A will never tell their stories. Their families received telegrams informing them their loved ones were prisoners of war, then later, more telegrams announcing their deaths. The details were sparse, the circumstances unclear. Only now, decades later, can we begin to understand what they endured. The research into POW camps has expanded. Survivors recorded their testimonies. Historians pieced together the daily reality of life behind the wire. But the dead remain silent, remembered only by these stones and memorials. Their names carved into granite, their service acknowledged, their sacrifice not forgotten, even if the world has moved on. The liberation of Moosburg on April 29, 1945, represents a microcosm of the war's end in Europe, a desperate German defense by troops who knew they were beaten, an overwhelming American assault that achieved its objective despite obstacles, and the revelation of suffering that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The 14th Armored Division accomplished its mission. They secured the town, they crossed the Isar, even if not in the manner they'd planned. They liberated over 100,000 prisoners, and they continued their advance south, pursuing the remnants of German forces toward the Alpine redoubt that Hitler's propaganda claimed existed, but that never truly materialized. For the prisoners, liberation brought mixed emotions. Joy, certainly, relief beyond measure, but also trauma that would take years to process. The sudden shift from captivity to freedom proved disorienting for many. Some prisoners couldn't believe it was real. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, knowing so many comrades hadn't made it. The medical crisis following liberation was immense. Thousands of men needed immediate treatment. Many required hospitalization for weeks or months. Some died even after liberation, their bodies too damaged by prolonged malnutrition and disease to recover. American military government officials took control of Moosburg, establishing order and beginning the process of repatriating prisoners to their home countries. British prisoners returned to Britain, French to France. Americans began the long journey back across the Atlantic. The Russian prisoners faced a darker fate. Stalin's regime viewed any Soviet soldier who surrendered as a traitor. Many liberated Soviet POWs were sent directly to gulags upon their return. They survived Nazi captivity only to face Soviet imprisonment, a cruel irony that underscores the moral complexities of this period. For the town of Moosburg itself, the war's end brought enormous changes. The camp was dismantled, the barracks torn down. Life gradually returned to something resembling normalcy.
but the town would forever be associated with Stalag 7A. That legacy couldn't be erased. Today, Moosburg acknowledges its history, the memorials, the information boards, the cemetery at Oberwert. These ensure that future generations understand what happened here and why it matters. In the week following Moosburg's liberation, the war in Europe raced toward its conclusion. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. German forces continued fighting, but the end was inevitable. On May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims. The following day, May 8th, became VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Celebrations erupted across the Allied world. But for the liberated prisoners of Stalag 7A, VE Day arrived late. They'd already experienced their personal victory on April 29th when those gates opened and American tanks rolled in. Many of these men had been prisoners for years. They'd missed births of children, deaths of parents, marriages of siblings, years of their lives stolen by captivity. Now they faced the daunting task of returning to a world that had moved on without them. Families who'd learned to live with their absence, jobs filled by others, a society transformed by total war. The psychological impact of long-term captivity wasn't well understood in 1945. There were no comprehensive programs to help POWs readjust to civilian life. Many struggled in silence with nightmares, anxiety, and depression. Some threw themselves into work, trying to make up for lost time. Others found solace in veterans organizations, connecting with men who understood their experiences. Still others never fully recovered, carrying the trauma of Stalag 7A to their graves. The bomber crews from the 100th Bomb Group faced particular challenges. They'd been shot down, often watching crew members die. They'd endured captivity. Now they returned to an America that celebrated victory without fully understanding the cost. Frank Murphy, the navigator who caught Patton's attention, eventually recovered his health. He went home, reunited with his family, and tried to rebuild his life. But the years in Stalag 7A marked him forever. 75 years after its liberation, Stalag 7A exists primarily in memory and archives. The residential development that replaced it shows no obvious signs of the camp. Children play in yards where prisoners once starved, cars park where barracks once stood. But the story refuses to disappear. Survivors wrote memoirs, historians compiled records, documentaries examined the camp's history, and people like the narrator whose words inspired this account continue to visit Moosburg, walking the ground, following the route of the 14th Armored Division's attack, standing at the Isar Bridge where German engineers detonated their charges. These acts of remembrance matter. They ensure that the suffering of those 115,000 prisoners isn't forgotten. They honor the American soldiers who fought to liberate them. They acknowledge the German civilians of Moosburg who lived alongside the camp, some willingly ignorant, others helplessly aware of the suffering nearby. The story of Moosburg also complicates simple narratives about the war. Yes, Germany was defeated. Yes, the prisoners were liberated. Yes, justice was eventually served at Nuremberg.
But the trauma endured. The dead remained dead. The years of captivity couldn't be returned. Liberation was a beginning, not an ending. The true conclusion of these prisoners' stories came years later, in quiet moments of healing or in final breaths taken far from Bavaria. The connection to the 100th Bomb Group adds another layer of meaning. These men flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war. The skies over Germany bristled with flak and fighters. The Bloody 100th earned its nickname through horrific losses. Those who survived their tours went home as heroes. Those shot down and captured spent years in camps like Stalag 7A, their heroism unacknowledged, their suffering unknown to the public. When they finally returned, America had moved on. The war was over. The parades had ended. Everyone wanted to look forward, not back. So many of these former prisoners stayed quiet about their experiences. They didn't talk about the camps. They didn't describe the hunger. They locked those memories away and tried to live normal lives. Only in recent decades, as that generation reached old age, did many begin to share their stories. Historians recorded interviews, museums preserved artifacts, books documented the POW experience in unprecedented detail. Now, as the last survivors pass away, these records become even more precious. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to Stalag 7A, no one who can describe the smell of the barracks, the taste of the thin soup, the sound of Allied bombers overhead bringing both hope and terror. All we'll have are the accounts they left behind, the photographs, the official records, the artifacts in museums and places like the cemetery at Oberwerth, where stones mark the graves of men who never came home. The story of Moosburg connects threads from across World War II. The strategic bombing campaign that brought down aircraft like those of the 100th Bomb Group, the ground war that saw Patton's armies racing across Europe, the treatment of prisoners that violated every principle of civilized warfare, and the final desperate defense of a doomed regime. On April 29, 1945, these threads converged in a small Bavarian town. American tankers fought SS troops for a bridge. Combat engineers built a pontoon crossing under fire, and 115,000 prisoners walked through gates that had held them for years. 7 days later, the war in Europe ended. But for those prisoners, for the survivors of Stalag 7A, the war's true ending came on that April morning, when American voices called out in English and the gates swung open, and freedom, that abstract concept that had sustained them through years of suffering, became suddenly, overwhelmingly real. They stumbled out into the spring sunlight, blinking against brightness their eyes had forgotten. They touched the Sherman tanks as if to confirm they were real. They wept, they laughed, they embraced soldiers they'd never met, but who represented salvation itself. In that moment, Moosburg became more than just another liberated town. It became a symbol of endurance, of survival against impossible odds, of the moment when hope, tested beyond all reasonable limits, finally proved justified. The Isar River still flows through Moosburg, its waters unchanged by the passage of decades. The bridge that the Germans destroyed in 1945 was rebuilt, stronger than before. Traffic crosses it daily, drivers unaware of the drama that unfolded here. The town has prospered in the post-war years. Its medieval center attracts tourists who admire the 12th century architecture. Cafes line the streets, children attend schools. Life goes on, as it always does. But if you know where to look, traces of that April day remain. The gas house building where Patton berated tank crews still stands, now with an added floor, but recognizable from old photographs. The Isar River where SS troops made their stand flows peacefully through farmland. The church in Mauern that served as the American command post welcomes worshippers. And at Oberwerth, the cemetery keeps its silent vigil. Walking these grounds today requires imagination. The residential streets that replaced Stalag 7A reveal nothing of what came before. The embankments where Germans dug foxholes look like any other riverbank. The bridge is just a bridge. Yet history saturates this place. Every meter of ground witnessed something significant. American soldiers fought and died here. German soldiers made their last stand. Prisoners found liberation. The architecture of suffering and salvation surrounds you, invisible but present. For those who make the pilgrimage to Moosburg, who follow the route of the 14th Armored Division from Mauern to the Isar Bridge, to the Isar Crossing, and finally to the site of Stalag 7A, the experience transcends tourism.
It becomes a form of witness, an acknowledgement that these events happened, that these men suffered and fought and died and survived. The memorials help. The information boards provide context, but the real understanding comes from standing on the actual ground, looking at the river that had to be crossed, seeing the distances involved, imagining the fear and hope that gripped everyone present on that April day. In recent years, historians and documentary filmmakers have raced to record the testimonies of the last surviving prisoners from Stalag 7A. These men, now in their 90s or older, carry memories that span 8 decades. Their accounts are remarkably consistent in certain details: the hunger, omnipresent and consuming, the cold that penetrated to the bone in winter, the fear of disease in the overcrowded barracks, the desperate boredom punctuated by moments of terror during Allied bombing raids. But they also speak of unexpected things: friendships forged in captivity that lasted lifetimes, acts of kindness from individual German guards who risked punishment to slip extra food to prisoners, the ingenuity required to survive, from crafting improvised cooking utensils to building secret radios from scraps. They remember the final weeks before liberation with particular clarity, the guards growing more nervous, the sound of artillery growing closer, the whispered rumors that liberation was imminent, countered by fear that the SS might massacre them all rather than let them be freed. When April 29th arrived, many describe it as the most vivid day of their lives, more real, more intense, and more emotionally overwhelming than their wedding days or the births of their children. Liberation was the hinge point on which their entire existence turned. Some broke down completely, weeping uncontrollably for hours. Others went numb, unable to process what was happening. Still others became euphoric, dancing and singing, despite bodies that could barely stand. The American soldiers who liberated them appear in these accounts as larger-than-life figures. Young men, most in their early 20s, who seemed impossibly healthy and strong to prisoners who were starving. The clean uniforms, the well-fed faces, the casual competence with which they moved and spoke. For prisoners who'd been systematically degraded and dehumanized, the simple respect shown by these American liberators proved almost overwhelming. Being addressed as Sir by a U.S. Army lieutenant, having medics treat you with gentleness and care, receiving food without having to beg or grovel for it. These small human dignities, restored after years of deprivation, meant as much as the physical liberation itself. The number 150,000 echoes throughout Stalag 7A's history. More than 150,000 prisoners passed through this camp during its operation. Think about that number for a moment. If you gathered 150,000 people in a modern stadium, they would fill it beyond capacity. Now imagine all those people compressed into a space designed for 10,000. Imagine them there not for a few hours, but for months or years. Imagine inadequate food, inadequate sanitation, inadequate medical care, inadequate everything.
The scale of suffering becomes incomprehensible. Our minds struggle to grasp it. We can understand one person's suffering. We can even understand the suffering of a small group. But 150,000 individual stories of hunger, fear, disease, and despair? It overwhelms comprehension. Yet each of those 150,000 was an individual, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband or father. Each had a name, a hometown, a life interrupted by war and captivity. When the 14th Armored Division liberated Stalag 7A, they freed approximately 115,000 prisoners who were present on that day. But the true count of those who suffered here can never be fully known. Some died and were buried at Oberwerth. Others succumbed to disease and were buried in mass graves. Still others were transferred to different camps or died during the forced marches. Some escaped, like Gail Cleven. The chaos of war's end meant records were incomplete or destroyed. We can never know every name, never honor every individual sacrifice. The best we can do is remember the camp itself and acknowledge that within its barbed wire perimeter, human suffering existed on an almost unimaginable scale. This is why places like Moosburg matter, why memorials must be maintained, why stories must be told. Because forgetting would compound the tragedy. It would suggest that this suffering was meaningless, that these men endured for nothing, that their sacrifice can simply disappear into the past. What does Moosburg teach us 3/4 of a century after liberation? The lessons are numerous and sobering. First, that international laws like the Geneva Conventions mean nothing without enforcement. The agreements protecting prisoners of war existed on paper throughout the war. They did nothing to prevent the conditions at Stalag 7A from deteriorating to life-threatening levels. Second, that suffering takes many forms. The Holocaust rightly occupies a central place in our understanding of World War II's horrors. But POW camps, while different in purpose and operation, inflicted their own forms of torment. Prisoners at Stalag 7A weren't sent to gas chambers, but many died nonetheless from neglect and privation. Third, that liberation isn't the end of the story. When those gates opened, the prisoners' struggles didn't magically cease. They faced months or years of physical recovery, decades of psychological trauma, and a lifetime of trying to reintegrate into a world that had moved on without them. Fourth, that individuals matter even in the vast machinery of total war. Frank Murphy's face catching Patton's attention, the German engineer who hesitated before blowing the Izar bridge, the American medic who gently treated a skeletal prisoner, the guard who slipped extra rations to starving men, these individual moments of humanity or inhumanity rippled outward, affecting countless lives. Fifth, that geography matters. The Izar River as a defensive barrier, the Amper River where SS troops made their stand, the location of Stalag 7A just northeast of Moosburg, the distance from Mauern to the bridges. These geographical facts shaped military decisions and ultimately determined when liberation arrived. If Moosburg had been 10 kilometers further from the American advance, liberation might have come a day later, a day in which more prisoners would have died. Geography, seemingly neutral, becomes morally significant when lives hang in the balance. Sixth, that endings are complicated. VE Day is celebrated as the end of the war in Europe, and rightly so. But for the prisoners of Stalag 7A, their war ended on April 29th. For others in camps liberated earlier, it ended in March or February. And for some who never made it home, the war never truly ended. These lessons resist simple moralizing. They complicate our narratives. They remind us that history isn't clean or tidy, that human experiences don't fit into neat categories of heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. The reality resists simplification. Moosburg forces us to grapple with that reality in all its messy, contradictory complexity. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Moosburg comes from Frank Murphy and the other skeletal figures that caught Patton's attention. When the general looked at them and growled his threat of vengeance, he was reacting to a fundamental truth. These men should never have been reduced to this condition. They were soldiers, airmen, men who volunteered or were drafted to fight against fascism. When they were shot down or captured, they became entitled to certain protections under international law. They should have been fed adequately, housed humanely, treated with basic dignity. Instead, they were slowly starved and neglected. The Germans didn't actively try to kill them in most cases, but the indifference amounted to the same thing. By April 1945, prisoners at Stalag 7A were dying at accelerating rates simply because the Reich could no longer feed them and didn't care enough to prioritize their survival. Patton's fury came from seeing American soldiers treated this way. His threat to kill the sons of bitches expressed a primal rage that transcended military discipline or strategic calculation. This was personal. These were his men, even if he'd never met them before. That moment captures something essential about the war.
Yes, it was fought for grand strategic objectives and noble ideals, but at its core, it was personal. Men fighting for their comrades, nations fighting to protect their citizens, the abstract made concrete in the suffering of individuals. When we remember Moosburg today, we should remember Patton's rage, not as a call for vengeance, but as a reminder that these were real people whose suffering mattered intensely to those who witnessed it. Every prisoner at Stalag 7A was someone's Frank Murphy, someone's son or brother or husband or father, someone whose absence tore a hole in their family's life, someone whose suffering hidden behind barbed wire in a Bavarian field was nonetheless real and significant. In the end, numbers only tell part of the story. 150,000 prisoners, 115,000 liberated, dozens of American casualties in the battle for Moosburg, unknown numbers of German dead. But behind each number was a human being, a life interrupted, a family anxiously awaiting news, dreams deferred or destroyed. The 14th Armored Division moved on from Moosburg. They continued south, pursuing German remnants until the surrender. They eventually returned home, were demobilized, and tried to resume civilian life. Some succeeded, others struggled. All carried memories of what they'd seen. The liberated prisoners scattered across the globe. Americans returned to farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit. British soldiers went back to London and Manchester. Russians faced an uncertain future under Stalin's suspicion. Each carried their own memories, their own trauma, their own version of what Moosburg meant. The town itself slowly rebuilt. The camp was dismantled, the land was repurposed, life continued. Within a generation, children were playing on ground where prisoners once suffered, unaware of the history beneath their feet. This is how history works. The urgent becomes past, the immediate becomes distant, the personal becomes historical. Time flows forward, carrying us away from events even as we try to preserve their memory.
But certain places resist forgetting. Moosburg is one of them. The story of Stalag 7A and its liberation refuses to disappear into comfortable historical distance. It demands to be remembered. It insists on being told. Perhaps this is because the story touches something universal. We all understand captivity, at least metaphorically. We all fear helplessness. We all hope for rescue. The prisoners of Stalag 7A lived our nightmare, and when rescue came, they experienced our dream. Their story resonates because it's fundamentally human. Strip away the military specifics, the dates and unit numbers and tactical details, and you're left with a story as old as humanity. People suffering, people enduring, people hoping, and finally, people saved. Imagine standing at the memorial that marks Stalag 7A's former entrance. Modern houses surround you, traffic passes on nearby streets, the sky is blue, the air clean. Nothing suggests the horror that existed here. But you know the history, you've read the accounts, you've seen the photographs, and standing here, you try to imagine that April morning when everything changed. The nervous energy of prisoners who knew something was happening but didn't know what. The distant sounds of battle growing closer. The guards abandoning their posts. The moment when the first American voices called out in English. You try to imagine the surge of emotion, years of captivity suddenly ending, the moment when hope became reality, the joy, relief, disbelief all crashing together in an overwhelming wave. You can't truly imagine it, of course. You can't experience what they experienced, but you can honor their memory by trying. By standing on this ground and acknowledging what happened here. By refusing to let their suffering disappear into comfortable historical abstraction. This is what pilgrimage means. Not religious devotion, but historical witness. Coming to the place where events occurred and saying, this mattered. These people mattered. What happened here will not be forgotten. The memorial helps. The information boards provide context.
But the real act of remembrance is simply being present, standing on this ground, bearing witness across the decades to events that shaped countless lives. As the sun sets over Moosburg, casting long shadows across the residential streets that replace the camp, you understand something profound. The past isn't really past. It lives in these places, in these stones, in these carefully maintained memorials. The prisoners of Stalag 7A are gone now, or nearly so, but their story remains. Their suffering was real. Their endurance was remarkable. Their liberation was joyous, and their legacy demands that we remember. Not with hollow patriotic platitudes, not with simplified narratives of good versus evil, but with honest acknowledgement of what they endured and what it cost them. This is how we honor the dead and the survivors alike, by telling their stories truthfully, by visiting the places where they suffered, by refusing to let their experiences fade into historical obscurity. Moosburg, General Patton, 100th Bomb Group. 3 elements of a story that converged on April 29, 1945, in a small Bavarian town. A story of suffering and salvation, of war's cruelty and humanity's endurance, of the moment when hope, tested beyond all limits, finally proved true. This is the story of Moosburg, a story that must be told, a story that must be remembered, a story that reminds us of war's terrible cost and liberation's precious gift. The gates that opened on that April morning can never close again. The prisoners who walked through them into freedom earned that liberation through years of suffering. And we, the inheritors of their sacrifice, owe them the simple dignity of remembrance. Remember Stalag 7A. Remember the liberation. Remember the 115,000 who walked free and the unknown thousands who didn't survive to see that day. Remember the American soldiers who fought to open those gates. Remember even the suffering of German soldiers caught in a war that had already been lost. Remember all of it, in all its complexity and contradiction. This is how we honor the past. This is how we ensure that suffering has meaning. This is how we connect the generation that fought that war with generations that came after. Standing at the memorial, you understand this. And as you turn to leave, walking back toward modern Moosburg with its cafes and shops and ordinary life, you carry that understanding with you. The past isn't really past. It lives in these places, waiting for those willing to listen. And in listening, in remembering, in telling these stories, we ensure that the prisoners of Stalag 7A did not suffer in vain. Their liberation mattered. Their survival mattered. Their stories matter still. This is Moosburg. This is where it happened. This is why we remember.